Today, our guest is Jim Canfield. Now, Jim Canfield is the Managing Director of CEO Tools. And CEO Tools provides winning strategies and business performance tools that empower CEOs to drive profitable growth. Jim brings a unique blend of past experience, including extensive learning in leadership theory and practice. Jim has often said he's been the been there, done that guy. So he brings that.
This morning, I'd like to talk about some thoughts around how we guide and lead in a situation that's fraught with crisis and chaos. And those are big words, even a bit scary. And what I simply mean in crisis and chaos, crisis simply means it's happening to us and it's happening fast. And chaos means we don't have the answers for it. It feels out of order, out of sequence, out of sync, unusual, unknown, are all elements that we find. So as I tear those words apart, you start to see what I want to address. So inside of this, as we think about this situation we're in, I want you to think about a scenario planning tool. And here's what we're finding. A scenario planning tool can be used. It was originally created back in the 60s and 70s to look at a very complex, complicated situation or industry, and to boil it down to just two very fundamental characteristics, elements. Now, you may be thinking, Jim, our business is way too complicated to boil down to two elements, but in this case, this was created for the oil and gas industry. Some of you are probably in that industry. And you know how complex it is. We got to find it. We got to get it out of the ground. We got to get it onto tankers. It's got to get to a refinery. It's got to be turned into gasoline and then sold at a retail store. Pretty complex business model. But in that industry, what they said is, hey, it's going to come down to two characteristics. The first was supply. Is that supply low or high? The second was price. Is that price low or high? Now, using this tool, what we do is we look at the scenario as it's represented by these two characteristics, and we don't argue about whether that will happen, when it will happen, or if it will happen. What we talk about is, if that situation is in place, what has to be true? What scenario do we find ourselves in? So for example, if price is high and supply is high, that's an unusual situation, because normally in a situation where supply is high, price drops. So this would be abnormal. If supply is high but prices are driven higher, it's normally could be by an external force like taxes, fees, tariffs. In a situation where price is low and supply is high, that's a pretty normal situation. Supply is high and readily available, and that's driving down price. If we look at the bottom left, both price and supply are low. This has to be a demand issue. Demand has dwindled. Maybe solar has taken off and it's so cheap that we're using it, and prices are dropping to stimulate demand. Then we've got a situation where prices are high and supply is low. Now, this was all the way back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when gas prices in the US were about 25 cents a gallon. Supply was thought to be unlimited. And they said, well, the only way this scenario would occur is if an outside party of some kind was manipulating supply to drive up price. Well, lo and behold, 6 years later, along came OPEC. They withheld supply, prices skyrocketed. Now, in this case, in each of these scenarios, we set specific strategies that we would employ if these situations occur. So they're all preset, and when the situation happens, they adopt that strategy. In this case, the company that was analyzing this was Royal Dutch Shell, and they became one of the biggest oil companies in the world by being prepared to deliver a specific strategy, which was to deliver their highest margin products, which were called specialty lubricants, if their supply dwindled. And they did that, and when other companies suffered, they bought those companies up and became one of the largest in the world. So let's use this tool to take a look at COVID-19. Because one of the things I'm seeing when I work with clients is, I had a client who said, I don't know whether I should be cutting expenses to the bone right now or whether I should be investing in the future. Well, that's a pretty diametrically opposed couple of decisions to make. And I said, well, let's look at it in terms of your customer base. And so in COVID-19, we're looking at the impact on the business and your customers. Are your customers still interested and able to buy from you? is really what we're saying. Is it a low negative impact or a high negative impact? And the second thing we're looking at is, what's your timeline? Is this impacting you over the short term? And then we'll see what happens in the long term, or is this a long-term systemic problem, the way that it's impacting your customer base? When we started to look at it this way, here's what I found. Let's start in the upper left. Those who are having a low negative impact on their customer base, and that appears to be now and into the future, we're seeing that as a business model driven scenario. In other words, these are digital natives, people who have their businesses built online. Amazon would be a great large company example. They're online, they sell online, they deliver online. It's mainly virtual in the business they do until it gets delivered and processed and delivered to be sent to us. They've done well in this environment because we're home and we're still buying things. The others are digital platforms, like the one we're on, GoToMeeting or Zoom. You've probably read about the rise of Zoom during this scenario, because their product runs virtually, it runs online. And then last, those people who deliver essential products and services to us, grocery stores, drugstores, and all the people who supply them are all doing well because those products are in demand right now. Let's look at the opposite. Those that will suffer in the long term dramatically are what we describe as customer-driven scenarios. They had an impact in the short term, but in the long term, this could jeopardize their whole business. Gyms, salons, both hair and nails, elective surgeries, cosmetic procedures, day spas, they all require direct interaction with a customer or a client. And if things don't open up pretty quickly, if they were to be locked out for 6 months, my guess is a lot of these businesses won't even survive at all. We're also seeing professional service providers impacted in this way, especially smaller local ones who are used to meeting with their clients on a face-to-face basis, have seen an impact on their business. Let's look at the bottom left. Those companies who have seen a low impact on their business in the short term don't know the long term yet, but in the short term, it's kind of business as usual. Are construction companies. If they had a house or a building or a process inside of a factory under construction, it's likely to be continuing. We're seeing whole factories shut down in client companies, but the construction projects are going on. In fact, some are even increasing the construction and reconfiguration of facilities while they're shut down during this time. Landscaping. In areas that are available, like here in Arizona where I am, I've noticed landscaping companies are continuing to work. They don't require direct interaction with me to do the work that they do. And then remote programmers, people who build platforms. So any project or process related work seems to be moving on. Last, those who are impacted in the short term most dramatically, we're looking at that. I'm looking at that as companies who are infrastructure driven. So they built large facilities to serve a very specific purpose, oftentimes a single purpose. Hotels, solely built for us to spend the night, have meetings, maybe eat a meal or two. Car dealerships, large platforms built around the distribution of automobiles. And restaurants, with a model of having us come to visit to have a meal, have been incredibly impacted in the short term, as people have been told not to even go to those places, and many of them are shut down. So let's take a look at the scenarios, the strategies these different scenarios might employ. So in the upper left, those who are in a business model driven scenario or are finding customers in a business model driven scenario, expand capacity quickly. You've got to be able to meet the needs of those customers as quickly as possible. And to do that, you probably need people. Be looking at industries outside of your own to hire and train those displaced workers. Now, also one of the strategies that's interesting here is normally in a high demand scenario, we would offer the idea of raising prices. But in a crisis situation, raising prices can be seen as gouging or taking advantage of those who are disadvantaged. So what we're recommending is hold prices steady, maybe even reduce them in a show of good faith, but offer premium options and make sure you've got good high margins built in those premiums. People feel good about the fact that you're protecting them with their base prices, and then let them choose some of those optional add-ons that bring your margin or your average sale price up, but the appearance is you've kept your prices steady. If you're in the customer-driven scenario or your customers find themselves there, they're going to have to establish virtual options quickly. And this is a huge and, like caps and bold letter and maintain margins. One of the things we're seeing with all the customer-driven scenarios is people are quickly working to adapt their business into an online platform, and they're ignoring margins. And they end up doing something that can be the death knell for a business. They trade analog dollars for digital dimes. They trade analog dollars for digital dimes. In other words, a yoga studio that I was working with charges $20 to $25 per person to come to an actual physical class. And they're limited to about 15 people in that studio. What they found when they went virtual, and they did it really quickly without thinking about this, is all of a sudden they were only able, because of the market demand, to charge $5 or $10 per class, but they hadn't shifted their price and cost structure. So all of a sudden they were charging less, but they still had the same cost of instructor and everything else. And they were still thinking about 15 people in a class instead of thinking 100, 200, maybe 1,000 people in a class, because they were no longer constrained by the physical of a studio. Also making sure that as you transfer to a digital environment or a virtual environment, that you're beginning to capture lots and lots of data from your customers. For whatever reason, with face-to-face business models, professional, personal business models, I don't think we ask very often, what can we do better? What do you like? What services other services should we be offering? In a digital environment, people are used to giving you that kind of information. Bottom left, process-driven scenario, pre-book next jobs, making sure that you're practicing social distancing and stagger jobs for completion rates and dates. And in the infrastructure-driven, you got to repurpose some of those facilities. We're seeing hotels develop into medical facilities. We're rethinking how to use that space. Sometimes you need to reposition a business model. We've seen restaurants go from the model where the distribution model used to be, we went to them, they fed us, and we went home. Now the model is shifting to, they make the food and bring it to us. The only thing I would remind you here is, if you're in one of these kinds of businesses, we work with a restaurant who's a 4-star restaurant. And just a reminder that delivery takes away some of the price advantage that you had. You had a really nice experience that people had when they came to that restaurant. And that can work for many of us philosophically. They have an experience coming to you. But in delivery, that experience gets leveled out. So if you produce a really great high-end product that normally garners a much higher price, but it's served in the same styrofoam container that a lower priced restaurant might serve, you might start to see a blocking of wanting to pay more for that same experience. One of the recommendations we had for a high-end restaurant was to include candles and an extra dessert and some other things, better high quality silver flatware in the packaging that was delivered to make sure that they're maintaining that image. And a business model shift is a great example is car dealerships. They used to sell cars, and oh, by the way, if something breaks, we'll service it. The service was a secondary offering to the sale. Now it's flip-flopped. The service areas are open, so they have to provide a really high level of service at that part of the business, hoping that one day when people come back to buy a car, they'll remember them. So what we do is we just recommend each client goes through and said, if we're in this scenario, how can we best respond to these customer needs? How can we ensure in the left a reliable distribution model, making sure they can get the product when they need it? In the upper right, we want to ensure a profitable model, making sure that we're supporting that business and driving higher levels of margin. In the lower left, we want to ensure sufficient collections, watching those businesses to make sure their businesses don't trail off. And last, how can we facilitate the needed change for those people who are really making big shifts in their business model? Now, in all of these, you'll see the last question is always the same. Ask yourself, what do we need to do to protect ourselves in this particular scenario? As those businesses change, they won't all survive. And cash is what I would be watching in that scenario.